Ignatius Press and the Augustine Institute present the Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter. If you like us, please help us by subscribing and by reviewing us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you might listen. And don't forget to sign up for weekly updates and study questions at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.
Welcome again to the Formed Book Club. We continue to discuss Henri de Lubac's extraordinary book here, Drama of Atheist Humanism. We've done enough now that we can maybe situate where we are as we go forward. The first part, called Atheist Humanism, focused on Feuerbach, Marx, and Nietzsche, with a side note on Kierkegaard. But now part two is Auguste Comte and Christianity. And we covered the first chapter here, the meaning of Comte and atheism. We're on the second chapter, Christianity and Catholicism. There's four sections. We took antisocial Christianity, where he claims that Christianity is antisocial because it's basically the soul and God and eternity. Part two is, or section two is Jesus and St. Paul, where he says St. Paul corrected Jesus and set things straight. And now we're on two interesting parts here. The work of the Catholic priesthood and a holy alliance. So we begin again on page 192, section 3 of chapter 2, chapter 1 of part 2. The work of the Catholic priesthood. Joseph, take it away.
Well, again, right at the beginning, the first paragraph of this section, towards the top of page 193, it's his weird understanding of history. He seems to believe that Catholicism, strictly speaking, did not come into being until the 11th century, and which by the 13th had already passed into the phase of decadence. So basically, the Catholicism it didn't even come into being until 1,000 years after Christ, and only lasted for a couple of hundred years before it basically decayed. So, if you're going to begin your understanding of the Church with such a warped understanding of history, it's no surprise that all sorts of odd conclusions are going to be the consequence.
And the reason why he dates it that way has something to do with what Father said in his introduction. He thought Christianity, in its essence, was something that just had to do with the individual and God. And so if what he wants to worship is the collective, well, that reaches its apex, if you will, in terms of social organization in Christendom, right? So what he thinks is the essence of Christianity are these exterior forms holding together a cohesive society. And that just comes and goes, right? It came and it went in his view. But if you're looking at worshiping the collective, it makes sense that that's why you would look at it that way.
Right. He's mistaking the tree for the fruit, isn't he? I mean, this good thing was a consequence of 1,000 years of inheritance. It took that long for it to actually mature into the fullness of what you might call the High Middle Ages. But it's obviously a fruit of the thing, which is Catholicism. The thing didn't come into being as some sort of spontaneous combustion, evidently.
Yes, I mean, the first quote in that paragraph at the beginning on page 192, where Comte says, since the year 1825, our writings have shown an increasing respect for Catholicism, as he understands it, the immediate and necessary precursor of the religion that has, above all, to consolidate and develop the structure that first took shape in the 12th century. And again, you have this theory of Catholic history that it was just a kind of an amorphous movement of Jesus, love and be kind and compassionate. And then after it became a state religion or approved by the state under Constantine in the 4th century, it became hardened in its structure. But then we have what secular historians call the Dark Ages. And after the fall of the Roman Empire, there was a lot of confusion. but the church was still present in her God-given form during that period. But he sees, as you said, Vivian, at the end of the Dark Ages, so-called the early Middle Ages, 12th, 13th century, here's where there's a consolidation, and you see the social character of the church in Christendom. By the way, de Lubac writes this during the 40s. His first major work was in the 30s called Catholicism, the Social Aspects of Dogma, in which he made very clear that from the beginning, the Catholic faith has had an intrinsic social connection, which makes sense as a church, after all. We're not an aggregate of individuals who have no relation to each other, except for the fact that we happen to hold the same attitude towards Jesus. Sorry, I'm wandering on there.
And as Chesterton said in I think The Everlasting Man, or it could have been Orthodoxy, that the church was the only thing that was the bridge that connected the civilization of Rome with the civilization of the Middle Ages. The church was the connector between the two, the bridge. So it's not as if it just arises out of as if by magic.
And that's what he said, Everlasting Man, where he calls Christ the Pontifex Maximus, the greatest builder of bridges. Because Pontifex, pontiff, we have in English, means pons, bridge, facere, to make, to build. So it's basically a bridge builder.
But he reduces the papacy to being the centralized authority of the church. And so he actually wants to replace the Pope with himself. What a surprise. But he's actually going to require such total obedience and control, unlike anything the church ever did or ever desired to do. But yes, he talks about on the top of 196, it was by this means, meaning the papacy, that the bonds of society were strengthened. He sees that you can't have the strong bonds of society that he aspires to, a humankind in love with itself, without a total authority at the top.
Yes, and as we're progressing into the heart of Auguste Comte, and Lubac has all these citations that really back up what he's saying about him. I just wonder, he's a brilliant madman. And kind of like Nietzsche was a brilliant madman, And as we said before, hardly anyone knows that name now. Whereas Nietzsche, Marx, even Feuerbach to some extent, those are somewhat household words among the intelligentsia. And we have to ask ourselves the question, we could finish him off. Was he really influential, or is it just that the thoughts he had ended up being part of the signs of the times? And because his life and his writings and his philosophy kind of foreshadow the whole Great Reset, globalization.
And some of it sounds very Orwellian in the sense of it also seems to prefigure the totalitarianism of the 20th century, where the system, so the politics and sociology are united in a tyranny. And that seems to be what he's calling for. Obviously, he wanted to be the Führer, and that didn't happen. But basically, other people became Führers in his wake, so to speak.
Well, the reason why his thought is a big part of the air that we breathe is because he wanted to turn all knowledge of everything into a concrete science, including the knowledge of man himself, the knowledge of the universe, everything he wanted to reduce down to a science. We wouldn't have the expression political science if it had not been for Comte. So the whole, in fact, social science, every university has a social science department. as if these things are sciences in the same way that physics and chemistry and so on.
And you hit the nail on the head there, because as we see later on, he criticizes empirical science. So in other words, he criticizes the hard sciences, because the hard sciences should subject themselves to sociology, to society, to an understanding of anthropology. So, so he begins by being someone who uses the empirical sciences as a method of beating God. And then when he seeks to establish his own sociological religion, he then attacks the sciences because they are a threat, because they're going to question some of his presumptions, and he's not into being questioned. So then the empirical science has to become servant.
That's true. He says it, no question. But I don't think he's not so much attacking the sciences for their inability to get the truth, but rather he has what I think is a legitimate criticism. That is to say, the hard sciences progress by specializing more and more and losing often the larger picture. And so he sees a need for something synthetic, because science takes things apart and makes smaller and smaller areas where people, I lived with a Jesuit in Germany. They call him Blitzlofter because he was so slow. In his thinking and walking and everything. But he did his doctorate on the heat-sensitive organs in cockroach antennae, but a specific species or variety of cockroach. And in Germany, you have to do a second doctoral thesis called habilitation to be a professor. So he did his second thesis on the moisture-sensitive organs in cockroach antennae. Well, there's no question about it. This was the world expert on the antennae of these cockroaches. But where does that fit in the big picture thing? And so, Comte was saying, look, we have to unify this some way. And therefore, he sees sociology, and he's the father of sociology in that sense.
That's right.
As the master science.
But I agree with everything you said, Father. But what he does is he replaces the hard sciences with the soft sciences that are basically bad liberal arts. So the whole thing becomes somewhat blurred. He uses the empirical sciences as the foundation for his philosophy, and then when his philosophy outgrows the physical sciences, he then wants to subject the physical sciences to his sociology, to his soft sciences. And then we have this sort of twilight zone between the traditional liberal arts and these new liberal arts that call themselves quasi sciences, or call themselves sciences, but they are quasi sciences.
We'll get to the point where he wants to synthesize not just the sciences among themselves, but also poetry and philosophy as he sees those. I want to read a quote on page 197. It's from him. It's that quote there. This is Comte. In borrowing from polytheism the hypothesis of incarnation, so that's what the Catholic Church did according to him, we borrowed that. Except that ours is real, not mythical. Anyway, Catholicism not only enhanced its dignity as dogma, but above all improved its social character. This divine mediator, moreover, proclaimed, even obscurely, the growing tendency of mankind to look for a supreme providence in its own midst. You see how this is moving towards this, let's just leave Christ out and have humanity be God. Catholicism brought out this tendency more strongly. Such a progression was to end in the complete elimination of the fictitious being, when the real being should have acquired sufficient greatness and stability to replace its necessary forerunner completely. Who's the real being? Humanity.
Right.
Yeah, the real being is an abstract concept, which is curious in itself, right? You get rid of an incarnate God who was flesh and blood and replace it with an abstract concept, and that apparently is the real.
And the reason why, he has a very utilitarian view of everything. If it doesn't fit his project, it has no use. That's why he doesn't care for the abstract sciences. What good is it to know what the antennae on a cockroach have or don't have? And what good is it for theologians or metaphysicians to argue about the attributes of the divine or whatever? he sees all of this as an abstraction that's pointless and unnecessary because it doesn't do anything about building this brotherhood of man that is his project. And so that's why he sees all this as a passing phase. He sees the metaphysicians as a passing phase. He sees the abstract sciences also as a passing phase because it has no use for this mankind being in love with itself and we're all going to get along and with this new society that is coming into being. So that's what he's doing.
It's interesting that he's doing with sociology what Marx did with economics. That is, let's change the world. Let's not think about it. Let's change it. And the whole focus is on what man does, as homo faber, man, the maker.
Again, once you abstract, make men an abstract, so make men humanity, then obviously you can kill people in pursuit of the perfect humanity, and that's why communists and followers of Comte in this ideology, that's what it is. It's not a philosophy in a deep sense, and end up by killing millions of people because they're pursuing the good as they see it. Well, who cares about people when you're working for humanity, right?
Sure,
it's God,
especially other people.
That's why he can't have any abstract think. Truly, he's made man into an abstraction, but he can't allow any abstract thinking because that leads people to ask questions. Well, why do we do it this way instead of that way? Once this new society comes into being, it's going to be settled science. See, settled science. So we don't need to reopen any of these questions. We don't need to have any more rhetorical questions. No, it's settled science. Yeah, so
it's the science trademark.
Yeah. Yes, there is. We are definitely breathing the air of Comte in so many ways without our even realizing it.
And one thing you can do, even if we can't trace, and maybe we can, the lines that go from Comte to ourselves, what he's done shows us what's actually happening now. In fact, it gives it a greater clarity because he was a systematic, intelligent, brilliant thinker, and amidst the blur of good news and false news and misinformation and something that we're submerged in, he kind of shows us the skeleton, if you will, or the structure of what we're actually going through. I do want to point out this one odd thing on page 198 there, which is talking about what does Catholicism do, as the intermediate stage. In the middle of the page, he's talking about the Virgin Mary. Nothing was more suited than, quote, this holy idealization of the feminine type, close quote, to pave the way for the, quote, final conception, close quote, of which it was the mystical forerunner. Better than the divine mediator, this truly human mediatrix foreshadowed our cult in its normal state.
And that's why he sees Protestantism as a step backwards. So he sees the cult of the Virgin, the cult of the saints as moving toward this worship of the human being. And he sees this as a step in the right direction. And then along comes Protestantism on page, what page am I on? I'm on page 204, shattering the initiative of the heart, he says. It provoked the revolt of the mind. While Catholicism tended to give the forms of worship their natural ascendancy, meaning this movement toward worshiping man, Protestantism gives a false preponderance to dogma. With it, absolute influences and individualistic tendencies are once more unleashed. It sets up personal investigation against the opinion of society. Wherever it establishes itself, the anarchic principle, although kept in check by the transitional system, meaning Catholicism, creeps in on every hand in line with the individual examination of biblical beliefs. Now, Comte doesn't like the Bible, Lubac goes on to say, but and I'm not here to justify Luther or any of these people to contra Comte, but what I am saying is that he sees any questioning at all. So he applies the same rigorous criticism to liberalism for the same reason. Anyone who asks a question is a danger to society. That's bad.
Yeah, but it's irony that he talks about Protestantism having a preponderance to dogma, gives a preponderance to dogma, as if the Catholic Church does not have its own doctrines, which it's absolutely emphatic about and refuses to bend on. So this idea that somehow Protestantism is more, for want of a better word, rational than Catholicism is, shall we say, eyebrow raising, and just phrases like the opinion of society. When people can start talking about the opinion of society, you're in trouble.
Yes.
Right? Who's going to speak on behalf of society, right?
Right. And again, we can hear echoes of this in our own age. What's cancel culture? You're going against the narrative that's already been accepted by everybody else but you. You're a problem. We got to cancel you, right? Yes. And the reason why he thinks Protestantism is more dogmatic, not than Catholicism as we understand it, but the Catholicism that was tending toward this cult of the saints and the Marian devotion and all of this. He saw this as the heart leading away from this over-intellectualization of the high middle stage scholasticism. He saw this. He's setting up false contraries here, but it's important to know that that's why he sees Protestantism. Now we're all back to arguing over dogma again. And we lost all this heartfelt, love for Mary and the saints and our brother and blah, blah, blah. Now we're all back to fighting over dogma, which he sees as going backwards.
Yes, because he sees Catholicism as being monolithic, where no one is allowed to think because the dogma is already there. Whereas Protestantism, individuals can challenge and ask questions and so on. And that's what he is opposing. On page 200, about 5 lines down, he says, whether in paganism, this is de Lubac summarizing him, whether in paganism or in Christianity, the historical role of the priesthood is the same, what are priests for? Or worship to God? No, not that. To use the religion officially under its protection in such a way as to counter the antisocial effects of that religion, even at the cost of betraying its spirit. So that's the point of the priesthood, is to keep you from thinking and being on your own and having a personal opinion on things. It's to make sure that you have social cohesion.
And this would be someone who now has set up another one of these false dichotomies that somehow in becoming a Catholic, I leave my mind at the door. That somehow obedience and intellectual assent to the wisdom of the church requires, now I can never ask a question or ever have a doubt or ever, it's a false dichotomy that just isn't what the real spirit of Catholicism is.
Right, but he likes that.
I'm going to jump ahead here, but we'll jump back again. But just in light of what Father just quoted and what you've just said, Vivian, there's on page 229. There's actually a subsection in the next chapter called the priesthood of the scientists, and what I've written underneath there is scientism as clericalism, and that's basically that seems to be what Comte's doing, right? Is that his scientism, his worship of science, needs its own priesthood, so that his understanding of scientism, can become a sort of new clericalism. Can I say something else? Because this is something that's a passion of mine, and I learned something here which is eye-opening. So Jean Maurras, the leader of Action Française, was a major influence on T.S. Eliot, and it's said that Maurras was received into the church on his deathbed. I don't know how true that is, but it certainly is true that Maurras said later than this. I had no idea he was a disciple of Comte. I knew he was an atheist, but I didn't know he was a disciple of Comte. But he said that his philosophy was summed up in the three words, catholique, classiciste, monarchique. And then when Eliot is received into the church in 1927, he says, I am a royalist, a classicist, and a Catholic. Consciously mirroring Charles Maurras's description of himself. So obviously this is later, but I think even at this point, for a long while, and this explains it. That Action Française and Charles Maurras, they were pro-Catholic while being atheists, because they saw the use of the Catholic thing. And of course, they were more conservative than Comte. They wanted tradition and things like that. But basically, the Catholic Church was a tool with which to bring about their atheistic political ideals. And I had no idea that he was a follower, a disciple, as de Lubac calls him, of Comte.
Amazing. And that, that goes back to what Father said just before, that this so-called criticism of the clergy is the very thing that Comte likes about the clergy, and now wants to use it as an instrument in his society. He's going to make his own priesthood that's going to put the shutdown on thinking and questioning, and we're going to just have this perfect social cohesion.
And who's going to do it?
And who's going to do it?
Section 4, a holy alliance between positivism and Catholicism. Mm-hmm. And on page 209, paragraph at the bottom, at the heart of Catholicism, there was a privileged body in whom its spirit was incarnate and its power maintained, the Jesuits.
Dun, 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 dun.
Yeah. And so on page 210, about a third of the way down, he says de Lubac says, there was still a hope that during the coming period of transition, the Jesuits, abandoning their, quote, corruptive intrigues and returning to their original vocation in the reconstruction of spiritual power. So that's how he sees the vocation of Jesuits. The reconstruction of spiritual power would give the Catholic dogma short shrift in order to concentrate upon ritual so as to prepare a backward but estimable public for the worship of humanity. A backward but estimable public. So you have to shepherd the sheep into believing without questioning. And the Jesuits would be the perfect persons to do that.
And then what does he do? He and another fellow start writing letters to Jesuit leaders to try to get them to sign on to this project.
He wrote the General of the Jesuits.
And thank God they turned him down.
Yeah.
But even
the wording there, about the Jesuits, their original vocation in the reconstruction of spiritual power. And again, his understanding of power is only sociological. And the spiritual is sociological power, not spiritual power. Of course, spiritual power is the life of Christ. And in that sense, of course, the Jesuits were looking to revivify that sort of spiritual power in the life of the world. But it's not the sort of power that Comte's thinking about, which is very much an applied political power.
And even though they didn't take the bait, de Lubac has a very sobering comment on the bottom of 213. This temptation has been repeated in various forms, at times more serious and more specious in appearance, and it will arise again. But the Church, assisted by the Spirit of Christ, will not succumb to it.
Yeah. Another interesting thing, the page before that, we've already seen how he says that Christ is not fit to unloose the sandals of St. John the Baptist. And St. Paul obviously invented Christ. But here we see actually in page 212, and this is Comte, I think, feel how superior Ignatius Loyola is in every way to their Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
He really hates Christ. I mean,
yes.
It's pathological, right? It's obsessively pathological.
So I think we could conclude this session with the last sentence of the chapter here on page 214. De Lubac asks, what fruits did Auguste Comte expect of such an alliance between positivists and the Church? What future was at stake? To find the answer to these questions, it is necessary to consider, at least in broad outline, the positivist transpositions, and that is the title of the next chapter, with which we'll begin in our next session. Thank you for listening and watching. God bless you.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.